Evolution has pulled a simulation over your eyes that optimizes you for survival and not accuracy. Tragically, this prepares us for savannas, not cities, and that makes modern life very difficult to navigate well. But joining me today is legendary biologist Robert Sapolsky, and we're going to take a hard look at the hidden truth. While there is no God, there is no free will, and nothing happens for a reason, you can still massively improve your life. Let me ask, right now I think there's a lot of people that feel lost, they feel lazy, they have no sense of what to do with their lives. And given that there is no God, no purpose, and no free will, how do people go about improving their lives?
Right off the bat, what I think that's tapping into is one of the misconceptions about the notion that there's no free will, which is that is synonymous with, oh my God, if everything's determined, nothing can ever change. And all you need to do is look at the world around you and know that, like, people change dramatically, societies change, all of that changes, the brain changes. There's this whole trendy, sexy field of neuroplasticity about how the brain does all that. Yeah, change occurs. Where people get into trouble is when change has occurred, they conclude, thus, I chose to change. And that's where you are predicating your whole stance on the notion that we are captains of our ships and there's free will and all of that. And that's not the case in the slightest. When we change, it is because we have been changed by a certain circumstance. And why have we been changed in the particular way that we have? Because all those prior circumstances that made us who we are, over which we had no control, brought you to that moment so that you were going to respond to this stimulus in the way that you did and would change you in the way that it did. So we are capable of being changed. And even better, once we are changed in a particular way, it can even lead us to modify our behavior so that we're changed in that way even more so. And nonetheless, we are not sitting there and exercising free will when we decide, I'm no longer a Buddhist and instead I'm a nudist now or something.
So here's the way that I approach life is very much that everything is downstream of biology and ideas. And I've said many times on the show that on my tombstone, I wanted to read, "You're having a biological experience," because as somebody that has really, I have been changed profoundly. So I don't need to take any credit for that, but the just empirical evidence is I went from hardly being able to get myself out of bed because I had a set of ideas just based on what I had encountered, the home I grew up in, my personal genetics, and the things that I respond to. But all of that led me to a point in my early 20s where I had a hard time getting out of bed. I'm talking, I would lay in bed for 4 to 5 hours a day, every day. And it was really only shame that eventually got me moving. So I wouldn't even take credit for that. But ultimately, I had biology that was to the point where I could receive the ideas. And then once I encountered those ideas, I was able to put together what I call a frame of reference that, and I'll be as careful as I can. I know I'm going to slip up in terms of language that makes it sound like that I'm in the driver's seat, but have a frame of reference that is puts me in a position where I am on a path to improving and getting better. And so when you look at my life over a long period of time, again, without needing to clap for me, but as I've accumulated these ideas, it's had a profound impact on my life, the quality of my life, my emotional tenor, the financial outcomes, all of it. And so I became obsessed. As somebody who's worked in the inner cities, I've seen up close what it looks like when somebody hasn't been given the right environment with which to build their biology, with which to get the right set of ideas. And it's absolutely devastating. And if I try to map out in my own mind what it means to exist in a world without free will, I start actually thinking of myself as a change agent, as a capsule that carries ideas that when other people encounter those ideas, some of them will be changed. And so that to me is the frame for this conversation is going to be, what are the things that people need to do to their biology? Because they are hearing this, right? We can make that assumption. So they're hearing this. So now they're encountering these ideas. We'll assume that they're at least fertile enough soil that the ideas will take plant. Not all of them will, but it's just a more useful assumption. What ideas would you want to plant in people's minds during this time that will be most fruitful if they want to move in a positive direction?
For people to learn enough about biology and its interactions with environment and how it turns us into who we are out of our control, all of that, to recognize that blame and judgment and a sense of entitlement and self-satisfaction, and none of those things make any sense at all. And all they do is send people in a bad direction, either of wanting people to be treated less well than average because of things that they've done that you were willing to decide they were responsible for, or deciding that you should be treated better than average because of things that you've done that in actuality you did not earn and did not deserve, and that you were just handed by random luck in life. And if people come out of that, deciding, judgment is almost always a suspect concept, and it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to ever hate anybody, because that's like hating, you know, plants that grow with some toxin that have made you sick. It's just, outcome stuff. And that no matter how good you are at something, that doesn't entitle you to more consideration of your needs than anybody else deserves.
What do you think are the evolutionary reasons why we have that proclivity? So people bend towards, not even bend, they are yanked towards the illusion of free will. And as I really sit, like whenever somebody asks me about this, if I'm being interviewed, I'll say, yeah, free will is an illusion, but it really doesn't matter. We'll get to the societal implications because I know that's an important part of your book and your stance. But on an individual life, I think it is far wiser to act as if you have free will, because that frame of reference will put you in a more empowered mindset, which I think makes you more fertile for good ideas to take hold. Does that seem to you why we would, from an evolutionary standpoint, have developed that delusion?
Well, it certainly can be the fuel of motivation. And that is something that obviously is highly adaptive in many circumstances. It's also incredibly protective psychologically. I mean, we are a weird species in that we are the only ones out there who know that inevitably at some point our hearts are going to stop beating. Whoa, bummer. And the only way to function is to have evolved a very unique capacity for self-deception. We are a species that can generate enough circumstances where we know that bad news is coming and we can't do anything about it, and where that could be crushing, that it has become adaptive to decide that we actually have more agency than we do in reality. And I think the best way to appreciate that is to look at a disease of people who were not able to do self-deception and who were not able to rationalize away reality. And what that is clinical depression. These are people who are pathologically prone towards seeing the world for what it is. And they're like poster children for showing the psychologically protective effects of being able to decide that things are going to be okay and you're the master of your fate, and then that sort of thing. It's good for our mental health until it turns out not to be good for our mental health.
So how do we walk that line? Because that's one of the questions I had reading your book is, why try so fervently to pull people out of a delusion that as you just said, is better for their mental health?
Well, because it turns out it all depends on who the person is. Um, I would bet anybody who would go out and buy this book about the neurobiology and philosophy of the free will debate and all of that and actually go and read it, my guess would be they're not homeless. My guess would be they had enough protein in their diet when they were a kid and the opportunity of schooling that they actually know how to read and can comprehend it. I bet all sorts of things about them. In other words, they're one of the lucky ones. And there's this ironic pre-screening that anyone who has the luxury in life to sit around and think about, are we captains of our own fate? And what does biology tell us? And how about Aristotle and all that? That we're the lucky ones who have wound up in this position. And thus, what being convinced that there's no free will does is take the wind out of a lot of our accomplishments. What do you mean I didn't earn having my corner office and being a CEO? What do you mean I didn't earn my advanced college degrees? I worked hard. There are all those nights where my roommate went to parties and I stayed and studied instead. I earned this. I earned this. I earned love by being like a kind person or empathic or whatever. And like, whoa, bummer. That's deflating to hear that. If it's true, I don't believe it, blah, blah, that I did not earn any of this, that none of this reflected the core of the me in there with all these wonderful positive attributes. But what that mostly means, though, to me is most people on Earth, rather than being given privilege and power and efficacy and all of that because of traits that they didn't really earn, that they had no control over and they just lucked out with, most people on Earth instead are suffering deprivations and being ignored or neglected or considered unworthy of attention or because they're getting treated badly because of stuff they had no control over. So virtually by definition, anyone who's going to go and read a book like this is going to be bummed by it and feel like, oh my, no, I can't work that way because look, I busted my ass in grad school or whatever. And the people whose lives are being made a lot tougher by the fact that it's all random, all that there's no free will does is free you from the myth that this is a just world and people get what they deserve.
It's very interesting. So when I really tried to parse through, okay, what do I want people to do with this information? And from my perspective, and I'll be very interested to see if we agree on this, from my perspective, the only reason I want people to acknowledge that free will doesn't exist is that if you do not understand your own biology, you're going to derail. So if you don't understand that you have a bias towards in-group, then you're going to treat people in the out-group ridiculously. If you understand that you have a penchant towards in-group, but that you can, and this is something that I learned from you, so much of what we're going to talk about today I've learned from you, but take sports. You look at somebody that's of a different ethnicity that in one instance you clock as an out group. And then if they're wearing a jersey of your favorite team, you suddenly clock as an in group. So understanding the way I always say it is your brain is messing with you. Your brain is optimized to keep you alive long enough to have kids that have kids. Now, that's not the thing that I focus on. What I focus on is how do you have what I'll call a good life? And it's probably worth us defining that. So for me, my North Star is I'm trying to move the individual and society as an echo of the individual towards increased human flourishing and decreased human suffering. Now, I'm going to make the base assumption you're not a sociopath and all of that, because sure, the thing that makes Hitler flourish is going to be very different than what I hope makes the vast majority of humanity flourish. But that's sort of my North Star. And so to get people to understand, your brain is not optimized for joy. It's not optimized for pleasure. It is optimized for survival in a historic evolutionary environment that we're no longer in. And so there is this wild mismatch between what will make you thrive today and your impulses. So that's where I root around. Okay, this is why I'm trying to get people to understand this. Is there any of that you focus on as well, or are you interested only in that societal echo of, hey, morons, you're acting foolishly and you're holding people accountable for things that make no sense?
Well, no, I think framing things, and you've got the perfect word for it in terms of the evolutionary mismatches that we deal with. We've got, Paleolithic appetites, and suddenly we've got fast food and an obesity epidemic, all of that. I mean, the mismatch is a really useful concept in terms of all of this. We have a mismatch in that our building blocks of agency, our building blocks of a sense of efficacy and of registering with those around us were built with 99% of human history spent in small hunter-gatherer bands where you did have efficacy and your opinion counted because everyone's opinion counted, very egalitarian by the best guesses. And these were familiar, and you registered and you had a sense of efficacy. And now we're in a society where, just to mention, once we stumbled into idiocy of inventing like socioeconomic status after inventing stuff and the unequal distribution of stuff, once we get into that, we can have somebody who's born into poverty, and I'm not exact on the statistics, but in this country, there's now something like a 90% chance that they will still be in poverty as an adult. In other words, they can be subject to a world of lack of control and lack of agency and lack of free will in a pretty bruising kind of way that's very novel for humans. I think that's one aspect of the mismatch, in that our tendency to delude ourselves into thinking we have more agency than we actually do um, didn't have that much of a chance to go off the rails. It was pretty focused in reality back when we were being like 99% of humans. And it's this current world instead where it is so destructive for so many people to be taught that they deserve what they get.
When I think about the way things are, I'm always looking for what is the evolutionary explanation of how that would come to pass. Like, why, if we don't have free will and we are just billiard balls bouncing around, something is selecting for that. And when I think about meritocracy, is probably a good place to start. When I think about meritocracy, that isn't going to go away. No matter how many people recognize that they don't have free will. And one idea that I love of yours is this idea that we are machines that are aware of our machine-ness, but aren't comfortable with our machine-ness. And when I think about, okay, if I could get everybody to just snap, not think about meritocracy, I don't think it will work. And the reason that I don't think it will work is, as much as it pains me to say this, there are machines, meaning us, I'm using your word, that are better at things than other people. And whether we should or not, we value different things, right? So once you have an evolutionary algorithm running in your brain that says, not only do I want you to survive, I want you to pass on your genes to the next generation, and I want them to survive. So now that algorithm creates what I'll refer to as a simulation. So it is not trying to show you the real world, right? We only see 0.00035% of the available electromagnetic spectrum. So it's like, we already know this is a gross simplification of what's there. And if it's simplifying, it's making decisions of what to show, what not to show. And it's making those based on that desire for survival. So now I'm like, okay, if that's true, then the things that we have now, theoretically at least, are selected for because they do a good job of that. And since we are optimized to be good at things that allow our genes to pass forward, there's already a hierarchy of values. You're never going to be able to get people to ignore that some machines are better at those things that we value than others. Does that make sense?
Totally. And two levels of response. Um, the first, amid that picture of, yeah, we are driven to pass on copies of our genes, all of that. But then you get somebody who joins some group that involves celibacy. Or then you get somebody who adopts a child from the other side of the planet who bears virtually no genetic relatedness to them. And yeah, there are strong trends that have been sculpted by evolution, but you know, we specialize in the idiosyncrasies of being exceptions at every possible turn. I mean, there's not a whole lot of evolutionary biology that could explain like giving up your life for somebody on the other side of the planet in a setting like that. So we are shaped by evolution, but we manage to have a lot of wiggle room with it. But in this larger sense now of like, what do we do with the fact that we're machines who could know our machine-ness? What do we do with the fact that we kind of want to have a world in which dangerous people can't do damage and where competent people are the ones who are doing difficult stuff? How do you do that? And in some ways, dealing with the dangerous people is a lot easier. And quarantine models of all sorts that are out there that people who are asking not for reform of criminal justice system, but replacing it entirely. What's the much harder one for my money is the flip side, which is how do you deal with the fact that it makes no sense whatsoever to like decide that someone who has the skills to remove that brain tumor from your head and can do that amazingly well and is totally unique in that regard, blah, blah, all of that. It's really hard to construct a world in which they will not somehow feel entitled.
My wife Lisa struggled profoundly with her gut health and experienced debilitating stomach pain, so I focused my energy on learning everything I could about the human gut. Viome is on the cutting edge of this growing area of study with their at-home gut intelligence test. Just 2 to 3 weeks after sending in your sample, you can see your results on 20 integrative health tests that measure your inflammatory activity, metabolic fitness, and the health of your gut lining. As a special offer to my viewers, Viome is offering $110 off your test. Just go to tryviome.com/impact and use code IMPACT to get the $110 off.
We particularly have trouble seeing, but I worked so hard to get there. Being able to work so hard is another biological attribute, just like having like good dexterity with your fingers so they can like suture you without like making a mistake kind of thing. I think it's in the realm of we need to make sure it's only competent people who are doing brain surgery on you. And we need to have them motivated enough so that they've gone enough sleepless nights to learn how to master this. And to do all that, yet somehow have the person, rather than thinking, I've earned extra consideration, I earned to be able to be in the front of the line because of how skillful I am. And here's where I'm getting utopian ridiculously, for them to mostly just feel gratitude and pleasure at seeing what their hands are able to do. Wow. I lucked out. Wow, sit me down at a keyboard of a piano and look how it turned out that I'm the sort of person with a sort of nervous system where I can now play something that moves people to tears. Wow, how cool is that? That I lucked out and got to be like someone who could experience that. Experience knowing that you were able to generate this. Okay, so that's totally ridiculous that we're going to think of making people go through like years and years of neurosurgery residencies and like all of the agonies of that and the enormous emotional investment and everything else in there, that they will come out the other end and say, yes, all I do is feel gratitude that the randomness of the universe has put me in a position where I can help people by removing their glioblastomas. You know, that one's going to be an uphill battle, obviously. And there's that bias that the people listening to this will probably be tilted already in a direction where there's something they've worked hard at and they're good at and all of that. And asking that we just have like gratitude for how randomness turned out with us, that we were given the gifts to make less pain in the world around all these other machines. Yeah, you got to get a pretty highfalutin state of mind where that's going to work. Maybe all we could do with that, sort of a lower end version of the solution, is just recognize how inappropriate a sense of entitlement is in all sorts of domains. Because you can do something fancy in with a scalpel doesn't mean you are a better person than somewhere else. And that seems like a plausible thing to try to train society in. It's not too lunatic to get people to the point where a really, really skilled neurosurgeon and a really, really skilled garbage collector can both feel good about themselves and feel good that they lucked out to have this ability, but not that they're somehow better than the person next to them who can't do that.
This is a very complicated idea. So, as somebody who really focuses, I was going to say takes pride, but I know better. As somebody who focuses a lot on usefulness, I want things to be useful. I want to put useful ideas out. I want to take useful ideas in. So I know a part of what we're going to want to touch on today is very much what the societal implications are for this and how we can improve society. Criminal justice system, I know, is an example you use a lot. That'll be a good one to talk about. Before we get to that, though, what I have a mantra in business, which is don't try to change behavior, try to leverage it. And I feel, and you obviously acknowledge it. You say, look, it's going to be a tall order to get people to do it. I'm stepping into utopian zone. But when I hear these ideas, I start thinking, okay, well, how do we make sure that these become useful? How do we get them to generate momentum so that life really can be better? Now, you didn't expressly push back on my North Star. So I'll assume for now that we're both on board with we want people to thrive and we want to reduce suffering as much as possible. I know that I believe that getting people to the point where we give them as good of a shot as humanly possible to biologically be ready to absorb useful ideas and to encounter those ideas as much as possible. So I obsess a lot about education and what that looks like. In fact, before we started rolling, I was talking to you about, I'm so grateful to you. You've put so much content out into the world that just makes it more likely that people are going to encounter those ideas. Okay, so anyway, going back to the idea of don't try to fight behavior, try to leverage it. Don't try to fight biology, try to leverage it. So we've got like evolution has selected for things. And one of those things is that, and I think you have said this in the past, we are a hungry species. We hunger for so many things. And I think about when somebody comes to me and is like, hey, I'm really struggling in my life. The first thing I say is go serve somebody else. Get out of your own head, go do something awesome for somebody else. We are evolutionarily wired for that because we're a social creature. And so you want to do things that elevate not only you, but other people. So I'm not fighting the biology. I know you will get something positive out of that. And then the other one, though, is progress. Make progress in your own life. Set a goal and work towards that. I make video games. I assume you know nothing about my background, but we make video games here. And so all day long, we're thinking about reaching into somebody's brain and squeezing the dopamine centers to get them to want to engage. Now, for now, just assume that I'm not an evil schmuck that's just trying to get all the money in the world and that my whole reason for existing is implanting empowering ideas and entertainment. But nonetheless, we have to think about that. And so when I want to get to the point where these ideas are not encountering sort of utopian, like whatever's like, this is never going to happen. I want to say what's real. Like meritocracy is not going away because people value things, and we may change what they value, fair enough, but they're going to value a thing, and they're going to want to get good at that thing, and they're going to want to be praised for doing that thing, and they're going to want to feel that they're better for doing that thing. And it's like, we've already run the experiment. Monks are people that are like, hey, I'm not an idiot. I recognize I need to be grateful. I need to see a blossoming flower for what it is and really see it and understand a rock and know that there's nothing good or bad, but thinking makes it so. Just nobody does it. So it's like this tiny, tiny fraction. So do you think that I'm misunderstanding what will be easy to get us to do and what will be hard to get us to do?
I agree completely. It's very, very hard, it seems, to get around the problem of motivation and drive and even dirty words like ambition and things of that sort in a context of there being no free will. Amid that, though, we can show over and over that we can manage that in some domains because we have already managed it. Okay, so a bit of social conditioning. You meet someone and you shake their hand and they say, "Oh, you have beautiful eyes." And we're all conditioned to say, "Thanks." And most of us who are sensible say thanks, and then a quarter second later realize how idiotic that is. Wow, thanks for praising me for my choice of photoreceptor genes. Um, that's a domain where we've made some progress with that. Most people would feel sheepish if the other person went on for too long. Most people would be willing to point out the realities of agency or lack thereof if someone tried to introduce a law that people with your eye color get treated better in society. Most people would see the fallacy of that. So we've accomplished that in that domain. We're able to navigate a world in which people can appreciate eye color, and where in general, the person complimented for it does not come out of that feeling entitled that they earned their eye color. And I don't know enough about the history of people liking eye colors and such, but I'm sure there was a time in the past where, with a mindset where basically every attribute that anyone had that was positive was a sign that they had a good soul, because beauty on the outside and beauty inside were exactly the same and intertwined, and disease is God's way of punishing you. And that whole, there was a time in the past where someone said, "You have beautiful eyes," would know that they were being complimented about their moral anchor, because the two go hand in hand. And then we kind of learned, no, that actually has nothing to do with it. It's just like, so you can say, "Oh, thanks," because you're socialized and you say that. And like, if you come out of it feeling like you have earned that compliment for your eye color, that's ridiculous. Yet at times in the past, there's people who would have interpreted it exactly that way. We're in a mindset now that your eye color is not some sort of index of your worth as a person. We managed to get there. And we can manage to get there in other domains as well. Like, there are people, somebody with photographic memory may think it's kind of cool, or find circumstances where it's advantageous. I mean, there being circumstances where photographic memory is not advantageous, but we are of a sufficiently informed mechanistic world at this point that they don't think they had anything to do with their photographic memory, or the fact that they happen to have perfect pitch or something like that. And if people praise them too much for that, they're able to feel a little sheepish. I don't know. I just read a page and I remember it. I just glance at it and I remember it. I had nothing to do with it. I can just hear a C sharp in my head anytime I want. And it's always like perfect down to like a couple of beats of, vibration. That's how I turned out. We've been able to get to the point where some of those ways in which we can be appreciated for some positive attribute, We can accept the appreciation while accepting actually we had nothing to do with it. And I'm not sure I would be comfortable in a world in which only people with perfect pitch get to have COVID vaccines. We've done that in some realms. We could do it more, but it's not going to be easy.
Okay, so let me ask, do you believe people should build their self-esteem?
Yes. And just because I am of the place and time to, if nothing else, see that as instrumentally a good thing. People will work harder if they have good self esteem. People will be able to put their shortcomings into proper perspective and realize that something bad may be bad, but it's not the entire world and it is not your destiny. Things like that are protective and efficacious, and that's often a good tool to have to make somebody feel better self esteem. Like a great example where that intersects with all of this, a domain where we used to see room for blame and labeling and insights into lack of motivation, all of that is, when I was a kid, if, I had trouble learning to read and I simply was not getting there. And it would be very easy at the time for me to be labeled as lazy or unmotivated or whatever. And then along comes a scientist about 30 years ago and discovers that no, you can have some screwy thing happening with the layering of neurons in like layer 4 of this part of your cortex. And as a result, like curved loop letters, you tend to reverse them when you're looking at them. And you have dyslexia. And that's great. We just figured that out. That's great on a very concrete level, because people could then learn what to do for people with dyslexia so they could learn to read more readily. It gives you sort of more insight into the outliers. But what it also does, bring it back to this, is like in the old bad world where you're screwed up cortical layering in this part of your brain instead is interpreted as laziness and lack of motivation, is your self-perception and your self-esteem is built around that for the rest of your life. And one sees all the ways in that becomes self-defeating and like these endless, wow, it wasn't until I was 40 that I was diagnosed with this learning difference. And all those years that I felt myself being this, yeah, self-esteem is a good thing to build up for efficacy thereafter. Self-esteem is not a good thing if it fuels entitlement, but it certainly has its place. And we can see those circumstances where we decide we're watching agency where there wasn't, and the outcome isn't great, and the kid still isn't learning how to read, and they are being taught what their self-esteem is going to mumble, in their ears for the rest of their lives now. That's a pretty bad thing.
What should people build their self-esteem around?
Well, given that none of it makes sense, and we're all machines, and it makes no sense for a machine to feel good about itself, and that's irrational, except when it makes the machine work better, except when one has learned the contingencies well enough that the right kind of self-esteem will make someone kinder, will make them more likely to feel somebody else's pain, will foster all sorts of good stuff. Yeah, in those cases, if your self-esteem is built around, you know, the world is going to have been a better place because a whole bunch of molecules came together randomly and formed that thing that I call me. That's a good reason to have self-esteem.
Now going back to, because here is the confounding variable. You were talking about people understand that their eyes are just their genetics and they didn't do anything to deserve it, which obviously I totally agree. But at the same time, beauty has power. Uh, I didn't do anything to deserve being 6 feet tall, but I can reach things that my wife can't. So how I, coming at it from my perspective, I wouldn't want people to build their self-esteem around something that they didn't earn just because I don't think it will return anything super useful. But this is where I'd want them to start leaning into the delusion of free will and say, but I would want you to, for instance, just use your example to say, hey, go out of your way to be more kind. And doing things like that, that you're now putting attention and energy into, that I would say build your self-esteem around that. Now, again, this goes back to North Star for me. Everything is adding up to you want to do things that increase human flourishing, your own and others, decrease human suffering, your own and others. But I would encourage them to do that. Do you, at that point, have such a reaction to the illusion of free will and the negative consequences that you see to that, which the word you've used the most, like if we were to do a word diagram, entitlement would just be this gigantic glowing red orb. Are you so concerned that the illusion of free will creates a sense of entitlement and probably self-defeating, right? Because it's going to create entitlement in people who think they're awesome, and it's going to create a sense of self-defeating, I'm lame, I'm not worthy, in people who fall out of step for whatever reason, which could go back to natal, prenatal, epigenetic, I mean, before they're even born. Are you so afraid of that, that you would never want somebody to lean into the like, hey, like I know free will doesn't exist, but I operate my daily life like it does?
Maybe the conclusion is, some nice pragmatic thing, which is like it's impossible to imagine how we're supposed to function if we really, really reject the notion of free will all the time. I've thought this way since I was 14, and I can't imagine it or pull it off 99% of the time. Because it's really, really hard. Maybe what we should do in the face of reality of how hard this is, because we are people of our place and time, and things that intuitively seem just intertwined with our sense of efficacy and our goodness and our intentions and all of that. Maybe save the effort for when it really counts. Maybe save it for when, judgment is really consequential, when people really are causing damage if they secretly believe they're a better person than somebody else for something they had nothing to do with, when people are okay with the society running on myths of like any kid could grow up to be president kind of thing. Yeah, put your effort into the rare ones of those. And like, if you want to feel good about yourself because of your eye color, go ahead. It's not the end of the world. Save it for where it matters. And I think what is amply clear is, in a world in which the organizing myth is we get what we deserve and effort somehow is coupled with outcome, there'll be no shortage of finding places where it really matters.
Let me ask you, when you think about the grips of the biology, the biases that we have, the things that we are in the grips of, what are the ones that make you most concerned? Obviously, we have entitlement, which I think, if I'm understanding you correctly, entitlement is born of thinking that you have earned height, beauty, intelligence, whatever. What are other traps that we fall into that for tomorrow to be better than today, we need to get people out of?
One of the biggest ones is one of those uphill battles in terms of like how we're wired up in some very fundamental way, which is in the right setting, a setting of a feeling of righteousness, all of that, we like to punish. We like to punish individuals. And translating that into like actual biology, like one of the most reliable ways of getting dopamine running and anticipation and all of that is to have somebody think that they are going to be able to punish someone for an infraction and that they are doing something righteous. And you see the same thing with rats. You get a rat that is being stressed and is secreting stress hormones, and it gets to bite another rat, a complete innocent bystander, and the first rat's stress hormone levels go down. It feels better. And you see the same thing in non-human primates, displacing aggression, displacing frustration, and then especially inventing cultural trappings that tell you this is actually like good civic duty. That one's really tough. Because if you're trying to say it makes no sense whatsoever to have a world in which there's any blame or punishment, damn, but it kind of does feel good to punish. Like, I know of this guy who's coming up for what, 5 different criminal trials in the next year. And I will be very pleased if the outcome is if he's locked up for years to come and maybe even like feels lonely in the process. But yeah, that really doesn't make sense. I mean, I see this all the time in like at a point a few years ago, I do a lot of work with public defenders' offices with murderers and trying to teach juries about how screwed up brains can be and how like they will like virtually be guaranteed to make the wrong choice at various junctures, all of that. And there was some guy who went into a house of worship with an automatic weapon and mowed down a whole bunch of people. And it was completely horrifying. And a few days later, I'm listening on the radio saying, well, the alleged shooter here was arraigned today, and it was decided they're subject to federal hate crime charges also, and that makes them eligible for the death penalty. And my first thought was, yeah, fry the guy. Just son of a bitch. And then 2 seconds later, I think, what are you talking about? You're working on a death penalty case right now. And seeing, okay, maybe what we have to settle for is after 2 seconds of saying, yeah, fry the son of a bitch, to remember, no, that's actually, it's not by chance this person turned out this way. And I have no idea like what their view of the world is and how much pain and damage got them to that point, blah, 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 all of that. So maybe we should not expect our first reflex to be saying, oh, what a poor guy that circumstances made him a damaging individual. My heart goes out to him, and my task is to love the unloved or to love the unlovable. Um, be pissed off and want him to be fried 2 seconds later, and then somehow in there get into your algorithm to stop and look back on that and see if this actually makes any sense. Maybe that's what we have to settle for doing amid you saying, what are the things that I see as really insurmountable? Whoa, 2 seconds of thinking about this guy being like flayed by, the whole town square watching him be decapitated and horses pull his limbs apart or whatever. Yeah. Okay. Let's stop for a second. This doesn't make any sense. Maybe in the face of like, okay, we really like punishing, get people to the point where they can feel the pleasure in that. And then 3 seconds later, um, we have taught the more meta level of how we think about things to reflect on, does this actually make any sense?
It's interesting. I think we're going to have to define what makes something make sense, because what you're saying makes sense to me in a very stable society where we have a way to quarantine people. But again, I look at everything from an evolutionary perspective. Now, whether the following stat is accurate or just directionally correct, I heard that roughly 80% of people in the Navy SEALs score very high on the psychopathy scale, if I'm not mistaken. And that's because, from an evolutionary standpoint, you need people that can kill just without remorse, because you lived an insanely dangerous world where there were people that were coming to kill you. They did not think of you as human. You were other. They were going to take everything you owned. They were going to take your women. They were going to rape them. They were going to kill you. Like, very bad things happen on an evolutionary timescale. It is just a litany of tragedy and horror. And, obviously right now there are two hot wars going on that I'm aware of, maybe more. October 7th was a level of horror that was just startling to behold. And so it's like, oh yeah, humans really are capable of just an insane level of violence and dehumanization. And so when you say it doesn't make sense, it's like, it feels like maybe in this current time, in this country, it doesn't make sense. But I get why, from an evolutionary perspective, it was selected for. How do you think about that?
Well, one of the great sort of bugaboos about sort of evolution and sort of the first decades of social Darwinists saying what is what was meant to be, and sort of naturalistic fallacy, all of that, is this notion that what evolution rewards is aggression and domination and passing on more copies of your genes. And a lot of what both evolutionary biologists who like sit there and do math modeling, and evolutionary biologists who sit and look at animals, including humans, is, this concept of alternative strategies. Like there's lots of different ways in which humans succeed and passing on copies of their genes, and baboons. And like one thing I've seen in my years of studying baboons is the guy who was able to walk away from every stupid provocation instead of getting into a fight. When you look at his whole lifespan, he will have left more copies of his genes than the guy who fights his way to be alpha and is there for 8 months before somebody breaks his arm in a fight. Like nice guys. Yeah, it's not just nature, bloody tooth and claw, and it's not just that nice guys finish last. One manifestation of that is like, I am by nature extremely pessimistic, but I have to admit some retrospective optimism. Looking at sort of the Hobbesian picture you painted just now, one of the things that all sorts of nice socialized anthropologists will come to blows about is, when did our ancestors invent warfare? And there's one school of thought that says we have common descent from a shared ancestor of chimps about 6-7 million years ago. And overwhelmingly, what it shows is our entire history as a species has just been blotched with organized violence and warfare and such. And sort of citing certain contemporary studies of indigenous populations and rates of violence and such, and paleontological records of how often you're finding an arrowhead stuck in somebody's like skull when you dig them up, kind of thing. And then meanwhile, the alternative school is that when you look carefully, there's actually no evidence of organized warfare up until we invented agriculture about 12,000 years ago, up until we became sedentary, up until, either because of agriculture, one notable case where people had the greatest fishing hole on earth in North Kenya about 12,000 years ago and were willing to be violent to defend it. But as soon as you had people become sedentary and start farming and start generating surplus and being able to make things and also having surplus time, you could invent things like a standing military. You could invent things like hating somebody because they've got more stuff than you have. And I'm quite convinced by the evidence suggesting that humans did not invent organized violence until like the last 10, 12,000 years or so. And you look carefully at, say, the anthropological records, looking at contemporary hunter-gatherers and how often they're violent, and overwhelmingly it's built around they are keeping out people who are trying to come in and take their land because they want to like cut down the forest and things like that. Amazonian circumstances. You go through it, and I think the good news is we haven't been a species reflexively organizing into massive violence against each other for all that long of a time. It's a pretty recent invention. That said, what the best evidence suggests is that individual hominins have been killing each other at the same rate in every sort of culture on Earth over individual conflict kind of things everywhere you look. When you spend enough time, say, studying Kalahari hunter-gatherers in Botswana, and like if you're studying a band of 30 of these people, you're going to have to watch them for like 55 years running to get enough observations to tell you what their violence rate is like compared to downtown in Detroit over the course of a year. But when you get enough of those data, there's basically the same rates of some guy killing some other guy over reproductive access, of some guy killing some woman over a perceived rejection of overtures, of some guy killing some other guy over an honor violation. Yeah, that we've been doing forever. And that proves to be a very tough one. No degree of punishment in the form of a death penalty does much for crimes of passion. Whether you were talking about like an ancestor 2 million years ago, or people in most cultures on Earth, including all those nice, swell, heartwarming hunter-gatherers, you come home and you find your loved one in bed with somebody else, and your impulsive crime of passion there is going to be pretty unchangeable by external contingencies of punishment. So that aspect of us, I think, is really, really long lasting. The notion of a whole bunch of homonyms coming together and working in a cooperative way with the willingness to have a hierarchy of command to go and try to do damage to somebody else's equivalent group, that's not all that baked into our legacy, I don't think.
That's the first time I've heard that. That is very interesting. Now, knowing your own work on chimps will band together and do patrol parties and raid other chimp groups and kill them off. Um, Given that, that sounds more to me like organized military. It's not exactly a standing army, but it rhymes with it. So given that we are on that same evolutionary tree, why do you think that we don't have that in our just eternal past?
Well, for a very simple reason. First off, I wish I had had the luck to spend decades with chimps, but I spent them with baboons who are,
Baboons, sorry.
they're not
Yes.
chimps. They don't make tools like that. They're not as smart, but they're plenty interesting when it comes to primates being awful to each other in interesting ways. Um, Well, exactly what you bring up was the driving force on notions of like our demonically violent past, because our closest relative historically was chimps. 6, 7 million years ago, we share 98% of our DNA or so. And yeah, they have organized violence. They kill each other. They kill each other in ways where the males in one group will systematically kill all the males in another group and take over their territory and expand that. And whoa, look at this. We've got this legacy of 6 million years back and all of that. And there's one word that shows how this is not really the case: bonobos. Bonobo chimps, pygmy chimps, they used to be called. Bonobos have a completely different social system. They are female dominated. They have virtually no aggression. Nothing like that has ever been seen in a bonobo. They solve every source of social tension with sex, and sex of every stripe you could imagine. They're totally groovy, all of that. And you look and, oh, we share 98% of our DNA with bonobos as well. They are as close of cousins as chimps are. And even separate of the fact that we're not chimps, we're not bonobos, we solved our own evolutionary selective challenges in a unique way. All of that, we're as closely related to the most groovy pacifists out there in the primate world as we are to murderous demonic chimps. So that does in that one. And some of the most influential writing about our supposed inevitability of violence because of our shared chimp ancestry predated our knowledge about bonobo social behavior and bonobo genetics and what the genome looks like.
Okay, very interesting. It doesn't seem self-evident to me that if we're related to both of them equally, and we are in today's age certainly capable of extreme violence. Look, I'm maybe optimistic where you're pessimistic. I think the vast majority of humans just want to get on with their day and they're loving and kind. But we do have these weird evolutionary quirks that make other people the out-group, us the in-group. We have envy. So there are things that will then trigger that murderous rage. We are also I'd be very interested to see if there are studies on this, but as an entrepreneur, I will tell you that people crave certainty, and that when you give them certainty, you can get them to follow you. And people are so very malleable. And if you give them something to believe in and then say, hey, but we have to go kill these other people, they'll be here for it. If things are bad enough, and you need look no further than the rise of the Third Reich, and anybody unfamiliar with that history is it's just absolutely astonishing. And I am a big believer in what Solzhenitsyn said, which is, a line through good and evil runs through every human heart. So when I look at those stories, I go, oh God, I have all those the same ability to be manipulated, to come to just horrifyingly erroneous conclusions. So anyway, bringing it back to the monkeys, given how far off the beaten path to violence that we have proven that we are capable of going, when I look at bonobos who have every groovy flavor of sex, as you were saying, and I look at least in contemporary society, even now, like there's a shame, there is a sense of that needs to be in private. So I don't feel a ton of kinship there. And then with chimps, dominance, aggression, hierarchy, as a guy in business, I will say, yeah, that all sounds pretty familiar. Again, I don't know the studies in the way that you do, so I'd love to know, is there more to that story that shows that no, we're really in alignment with bonobos? And if we are, does that mean that if they had stuff to protect, they had a farm, they could hoard wealth, do you think they too would break bad eventually?
Yeah, which is a great question. I think what you're alluding to with your entrepreneurial self, recognizing the chimp in you, um, is, we're not a chimp, we're not a bonobo. We have been subject to the same evolutionary rules, but came up with a unique solution to a unique set of challenges, but nonetheless, one that can have a lot of overlap with how chimp solved it or bonobo solved it. But what I think is implicit in your statement is we show staggering amounts of variability. We have both, I don't know, Elon Musk and the Dalai Lama, or whatever. We're an incredibly varied species, and we are simultaneously the most violent species on Earth, but also the most cooperative and altruistic and empathic. And sometimes it could be the same person who embodies both of those behaviors, and sometimes it could be the same behavior. And it's in the eye of the beholder whether this person is a terrorist or a freedom fighter, kind of thing.
You can reboot your life, your health, even your career, anything you want. All you need is discipline. I can teach you the tactics that I learned while growing a billion-dollar business that will allow you to see your goals through. Whether you want better health, stronger relationships, a more successful career, any of that is possible with the mindset and business programs in Impact Theory University. Join the thousands of students who have already accomplished amazing things. Tap now for a free trial and get started today.
So we're a very in the middle confused species with tremendous individual variation. And thus there's an implicit danger to decide that any other species out there is a good model for making sense of how we evolved. And I think one can cherry pick stuff on that. And I guarantee you there's somebody somewhere on some organic farm wearing Birkenstocks or whatever whose natural affinity will be much more with bonobos. Or we're highly variable in that way. Great example of this. Okay, in primatology, there's this broad classification you can do across like 150 primate species or so. There are species that are monogamous pair bonders, and there are ones who are polygamous polyandrous. Pair bonders, gibbons, siamang, some South American monkeys, and then there's all the apes and most of the old world primates and all of that. So you see these two patterns. And it turns out there's all sorts of traits that go in common with if you turn out to be a pair bonding species or a polygamous species, a tournament species. And these traits play out in remarkable ways. In a species in which males mate with a lot of females, different females, you don't see male parental care because they don't care. In a species in which females are mating with multiple males over the course of their cycle, you don't see male parenting either because there's a high degree of uncertainty. In a species like that, where there's high degrees of aggression, there's selection for secondary sexual characteristics like lots of muscle and sharp canines. And then you look at one of the pair bonding species, and males and females look exactly the same because they've been selected for the same sort of traits, being good parents. And male marmoset monkeys will do more parenting of their offspring than even the females will. And these are two totally different sorts of pictures. Sufficiently so, like you go out in a newly discovered island and there's a new primate nobody has ever seen before, and you manage to see this one way up in that tree is a male. You see his penis, and then magically he falls out of the tree dead, so you've got his body to examine then. And over there's a female because you saw her nursing somebody young and she falls out of the tree, and now you can compare them and you know nothing whatsoever about the species social system. Right off the bat, if the male is a whole lot bigger than the female, you're looking at a tournament species. Right off the bat, if you look at, the length of time the female nurses and how much milk can be stored, you're finding out something about if she's a pair bonding species. And right away, you look at whether females and males have canines. It's a whole bunch of these, nothing more than that. And like you've just found out all this private stuff about them. So where do humans fit? And by every measure, some of our genetic diseases, the degree of difference between the average male human and female human in life expectancy, body mass, lung capacity, width of nostrils, all of that, sperm levels in the testes, all these things that are functions of that, by every one of those measures, we're about halfway in between. We're not a pair bonding species and we're not a tournament species. We're halfway in between, and that was part of what made us generalists. So on the average, we're that. And what's also clear is amid that average of us being halfway in between and confused a whole lot of the time, and basically that explains, half of Earth's poets and all of Earth's divorce lawyers, the fact that we're confused some way halfway in between, is that individuals are not always halfway in between. They're skewed way out on one end or the other. There's gene profiles related to hormones like vasopressin and oxytocin and their receptors, which are significant contributors to how stable and fidelious, whatever the word, how faithful somebody is in their relationships, how close of interpersonal space they stand in front of somebody of the opposite sex if they're heterosexual while they're already in a relationship. Like that lines of it. So we're this species where we don't fall into any of those patterns easily. And thus we're on some fairly thin ice in saying, in this regard, we're just much more chimpish than we're bonobo-ish or whatever. We're highly variable, and we, by definition, are the species that doesn't fit into any of those categories. And when you look at the individuals amongst us, none of them fit into what the average is for our species.
Yeah, the getting into how much of our makeup is either echoed in our body or driven by our body, I find endlessly fascinating. My wife and I have been married for 21 years. And so we get asked a lot about, what's the secret to a long marriage? And while I rarely give this answer, the thing that's in my mind a lot of times is I almost certainly have a lot more receptors for vasopressin because I get so much out of bonding with my wife. I don't know what to do with that.
Not to mention what she has to do with that. This is exactly our discussion of, oh my God, we're machines. And you just proved that you're a machine who could know your machine-ness in that regard. And does that do in Hallmark cards? Does that do in the feelings that you feel so strongly that they feel real even if they aren't real, because you're just a machine. Yeah, that's the challenge that we have, that somehow we need to come to terms with us knowing our machine-ness, in the sense that, like, you can do biomechanics on pelvic arches and angles of femurs with pelvic arches, and thus in this species they could leap in this way, and in that species they can't, and here's the equations that will prove it, and that could make perfect sense to you, and still your jaw drops open the first time you see that a gazelle can leap 20 feet across, a riverbed. And that's the most amazing thing. And you're like, can't believe the world has produced something like this. And you can do that and understand the equations that it makes it possible for their hind legs to spring that way. We have to be able to sort of come to some sort of, treaty and peaceful stance with our knowing our machine-ness, and knowing and sensing the gears just underneath the surface, explaining the things that make us who we are, and you and your vasopressin receptor profile, while at the same time still being able to say, like, oh, it's amazing having somebody who your universe revolves around them and theirs around yours. And yeah, okay, it's vasopressin receptors. We need to be able to do that simultaneously, because knowing, like, the architecture of a gazelle's pelvis should not take away your ability to just be awestruck by, like, how they turned out that way, how circumstances produced an animal that could that gracefully go flying that far in the air. So be intellectually taken with the biomechanics, and be grateful for the, like, awe and aesthetics of getting to watch it. And I think that's the only thing we can do with our being machines who understand our machine-ness. So, okay, good for you. You got the right kind of vasopressin receptors. Like, may it bring you lots of pleasure. And it's a good thing if it does. Somehow we have to reconcile that.
Yeah. Well, it's definitely brought me a lot of pleasure. That is for sure. The body is one thing that I'm always thinking about from an optimization standpoint. I'm always encouraging people that, remember, you're having a biological experience. If you're not getting sleep, if you're not getting sunlight, if your diet sucks, if you're not exercising, like, all of these things are going to make it hard for you just to process the world. There's a couple things I'd like to touch on just to really drive this home for people. One is what I've heard you talk about before, which is the idea that the timing of your parole hearing to when the last time the judge ate was, and then Phineas Gage. And Phineas Gage is the one I always reach to when people are like, oh, what do you mean? Of course we have free will. I'm like, bro, walk us through those.
Phineas Gage, every neuroscientist on Earth at some point was sat down in their grandpa's knee and told the tale of Phineas Gage, and neuroscientists almost are required to consider naming their kid after Phineas Gage. Phineas Gage was a railroad construction line foreman in Vermont in the 1840s. Obviously, like a sobrietous, reliable guy. If he was the foreman of this church-going, devout guy, showed up for work every day, all of that. One day, somebody, like, left a stick of dynamite where they shouldn't, and Gage was carrying this 3-foot tamping iron rod that you do something with that to make railroad lines go through mountains and stuff. And this caused an explosion, and it shot this metal pole into his eye and out the front part of his skull, and it landed 30 feet away with a large part of his frontal cortex stuck to it. And, he had just had an interesting biological intervention. And the remarkable is this went through so fast and with such force that it cauterized all the blood vessels. He wasn't even bleeding. He was, like, a little bit dazed and got up, and, like, somebody went and, like, got the boss, who looked in his head and said, oh my God, Gage, I see what's wrong. You've got a hole in your head. I can see all the way out of the top of your head. And they said, tell you what, Gage, take the rest of the day off. Let's see you tomorrow. And some of his friends walked 1.5 miles with him to go to the town doctor, who looked in there and said, oh, something shot through your eye and at the top of your skull. And weird. And this doctor proceeded to be able to document what happened to Gage, which was Gage was almost literally overnight transformed into this disinhibited, hyper-aggressive, alcoholic, sexually predatory, monstrous guy who was never able to work for years and years afterward. And what we had just learned was summarized by the doctor, who in his notes said Gage is no longer Gage. Something about that part of the brain constrains the animal energies within us. And that's a pretty good 19th century definition of what the frontal cortex does in terms of regulating behavior and emotion, all of that. And that was the first demonstration that you could change like the fundamental character and moral values and everything else of somebody just by mucking around with their brain, mucking around with an iron rod that goes through there. So this was an unsubtle one, and thus it's easy for us to appreciate that as the causative agent that had nothing to do with free will. But this is an extraordinary example. And all we've learned since then are subtler versions of it. One that should give one pause, which is, depending on the study, 25 to 75% of the men on death row in this country have a history of a concussive head trauma to the front of their heads, where their frontal cortex is. And when you put that in context, you're not looking at bad souls, or you're not looking at people who just are not capable of feeling somebody else's pain. Right? You're looking at a broken machine. You're looking at a machine whose brakes in this particular domain were shattered by concussive trauma. So, Phineas Gage was the first of our lessons in that. And all we've done since then is learn far more subtle stuff is underneath the surface than just metal rods or concussive head injuries. This is where all of us are turning into who we are. The judges, the hungry judges, I love this study. And it has been subject to some controversy. This was published in a very prestigious journal a number of years ago, looking at parole board judges in a particular country where the researchers were, and they examined all of the decisions these judges made over the course of a year as to whether to parole somebody or send them back to prison. And this was well more than 1,000 cases, something like that. And then looking for what predicted when a judge would free someone versus send them back for another 5 years. And out popped this flabbergasting finding, which was the single biggest predictor was how many hours it had been since the judge had eaten a meal. Oh my God. See a judge right after lunch, and there was about a 60% chance of being paroled. By 4 hours later, you were down to basically a 1% chance. Oh my God. This is like earth-shattering, all of that. What is this about? This is about something very simple. Like when you haven't eaten, your blood sugar levels go down. When they're low, you don't have enough glucose to run your brain, which is the most expensive organ, like pound for pound in your body. And you especially don't have the means to run the most expensive part of your brain, the frontal cortex. The frontal cortex that would make you say, wait, before you just send the guy back, think a little bit about his circumstances. Think about whether, someone like that makes you a little bit edgy because of how tough they look. Try to look past that. Think about how the world has been from their perspective. That takes energy. In the same way that we become more selfish and less cooperative when we're hungry or tired or sleep deprived and all of that. Yeah, it's low blood glucose, and your expensive part of the brain can't do the harder thing. So that's amazing. But what's even more interesting is, like, if you took that judge at that point and said, hey, look at this, you had a guy with the exact same history the other day there, and you paroled that guy, and this guy you sent back to jail. How come? They're not going to say because I had low blood glucose. They're going to quote Immanuel Kant or something and come up with a post hoc explanation. What's that telling us? Our most consequential decisions that tap into the core of us as morally reasoning beings, we're biological machines, all of that. That said, this study has been mired in controversy. One group sort of wrote in and challenged the conclusions based on statistics. And for my money, the original group reanalyzed their data in accord with these people's complaints and showed that it did nothing to their conclusion. Another group has challenged them on an artifact of how the study was done, and that was then controlled for and shown to be intact. Another complaint was brought up, which when you look at it closely, makes the point of the original study even stronger. I think it is held up, and it is held up in other realms as well. Go in and you're going to go into a bank and ask a bank officer for a home loan, mortgage loan, or whatever. Make sure you go in right after they've had lunch. The same exact phenomenon. The more hours it has been, the more likely they are to turn down a loan application. Studies where you give people job applications to read, and some of them by name or from an out-group member, and some are from one of us. And the more hours it's been, the shorter time you spend reading the out-group member's application before you toss it in the trash. The more hours a doctor has gone without sleeping, the more implicit racial bias they show when they make judgments about dosages for painkillers. All of that. Yeah, there's all this biology going on. And then the coolest thing is superimposed on that is this great cultural wrinkle that I saw in a paper that came out more recently, which is looking at one circumstance where the more hours it has been since the judge has eaten the meal, the more forgiving they are, and the more benevolent and the more empathic. What is this about? These are Muslim judges in Sharia courts during Ramadan, when they're fasting during daylight hours, and you're hungry then, not because, God damn it, I had to go to this meeting during lunchtime and I didn't get to eat and I'm starving now, because you're reflecting on the meaning of life and your responsibility to your fellow humans and what God wants of you. If that's the culture you're growing up in, being hungry because it's Ramadan makes you more merciful. Get the same judge 4 weeks later and they're starving because they missed lunch, and they're going to throw the book at the person just like the American judge would do. Whoa, so all of that mechanistically, and then there's a cultural wrinkle that's thrown in on top of that. So if you were raised in that sort of culture, two different types of hunger bring out very different things in your moral decision-making process. Wow, not only are we machines, we're really interesting ones.
Yeah, that is crazy to me that context can have that kind of impact on it, which also makes me think about dopamine, testosterone, things that people think they have like a really strong beat on. Oh, it does this, but in reality, they are way more context dependent. Walk me through that. How is it possible that testosterone can mean one thing in one context and another in another?
Because you are secreting it in response to contextual information. Incredible, like, mistake people have in their heads is that testosterone causes aggression. Testosterone does not cause aggression. Testosterone makes aggressive individuals more sensitive to social cues that trigger aggression. And there's all sorts of studies that have been done that show that testosterone does not turn on the radio. If the radio is already turned on, it ups the volume on it. It ups the sensitivity of the system to whatever you have been socially trained to learn to view as a provocation of aggression. So that, but then you see there's something even more subtle there going on. It's not that testosterone causes aggression. Yeah, we just got rid of it. And it's not even that testosterone makes you more aggressive if you are already getting the social cues that trigger aggression. What testosterone really does is make you more likely to do whatever behaviors give you status when your status is being challenged. Okay, you're a baboon and your status is being challenged because some guy is like hassling you and challenging you. If you're a baboon, status being challenged is answered by you get into a fight with a guy. Baboons are a lot simpler than us. But then in our world, all you have to do is go to like some fancy ass private school that's having their annual auction and fundraiser or whatever. And you see a whole bunch of like self-satisfied captain of industry rich guys there who are on the board at the place. And they're sitting there half drunk because they make sure the banquet has lots of alcohol flowing. And then you get to watch these like masters of the universe compete with each other as to who could bid the highest in this charitable auction. Oh my God, these are apes who are sitting there trying to maintain their social status by seeing who can give away more of their money. Whoa, we're a weird species. Go explain that one to a baboon. And you can show this experimentally. There are economic games where people accrue status by being more generous, give people testosterone, and they make more generous offers. The issue isn't that, say, testosterone makes aggression more likely, and that's the problem. The problem is that we hand out status for aggression so readily.
That is very interesting to me. And what do you make of the fact that, well, what I take away from that is that men are selected for their response to testosterone, which is why they have so much more of it than women, which means that men, for some reason, evolution wanted to make sure that we would defend our status. What do you think that's all about?
Well, that immediately fits into things like that gets you more copies of your genes passed on and that sort of business. Going back to the fundamentals there, what it tells by the time you get to us is there's a lot of different ways to optimize that. We're a complicated species, and sometimes you do that by like being a CEO maverick, and before you know it, that's one version of incredible status. And some of the time you do it by like being a warlord somewhere, and you know context dependent. We are a very heterogeneous species in terms of cultures and cultural values, and what we mostly have are brains that evolved not to be set in stone, but instead to be malleable enough to learn what your particular culture's rules are.
Do you think that it indicates that women are selecting males based on status?
Yes, and most studies indicate that. One classic body of work by a guy named David Buss, University of Texas at Austin, doing this massive cross-cultural study of people all over the planet, and like, here's 25 adjectives and rate them for how far they are up in your list of what you would look for in a partner, in a spouse, whatever. And what you saw was consistently men in every culture out there averaged preferring a partner who was a number of years younger than them. Consistently, women chose for partners who were older than them. Consistently, women put money earning capacity in the guy higher up on the list than the guy would do. Consistently, men put potential fertility higher up on the list than women would do. And this was cross-cultural. This was all over the world. Oh my God, some of this stuff is so solid there. And then you find out what the most interesting thing is about the study, which is regardless of culture, the most common number one thing on the list was kindness. Oh my God, all this cultural stuff and inculcation into roles and gender roles. And maybe it's not inculcation because biology is making that, and we're so different, women and men and Mars and Venus. And yeah, at the end of the day, like, everyone put kindness at the top of their list. So like, we make perfect sense as just another primate when you look at us through one angle, and then we're completely bizarre and unprecedented in another. That like, you can have people who are hunter-gatherers or living in like the middle of Chicago, and somebody who's a socialist or someone who's a capitalist or some, and they all come out with roughly the same list of preferences there, yet a list that has some stereotypical gender differences. Oh, we're a really weird primate. We're a primate, but we're a very unique one.
The things that people rate from a sexual attractiveness perspective has become very much a hot button issue. I'm very curious to hear what you think about this. Whenever I think about my wife as being like me, my prediction engine breaks and I can no longer predict her behavior. when I think of women, and look, of course, there's more overlap than there is difference, 100%. But there's a great, I'm going to paraphrase it. I don't remember who said this, but there's a quote that goes, any individual man is a mystery, but put them in the aggregate and they are a mathematical certainty. And I will say that the same is true of women. That makes a lot of sense to me, that if you're looking at any one person, of course, you have to get to know them. You have to figure out what is particular about them. But as you begin to step back to the population level, suddenly you get a lot of things, a lot of traits that become reliable at a population level. And so when I think of my wife as being very different than me, of having more classically feminine ways of approaching the world. So she doesn't have my level of aggression. She is far more interested in people than things. She's far more interested in subtleties of communication. She values me for very different things than I value her. I mean, obviously there's a lot of overlap, but just that there become these outliers. Do you see that as, yes, at the population level, there are big differences between men and women, or no, that's all much ado about nothing, and better to think of them as you would think of yourself?
Well, it depends in what domain you're making the assessment. Higher ability, appropriateness to cast a vote in a ballot sort of thing. Yeah, it took this country only a bunch of centuries to figure out that that's not a domain in which sex differences are pertinent. So there it shouldn't matter, and it doesn't matter, and equal pay and, all that sort of stuff. Hooray for a progressive agenda. When it looks at systematized thought versus relational thought and sex differences in that's a fairly reliable one. Those are interesting, and like people even know what different gonadal hormones do to the cortex during fetal life and stuff like that. So that's really interesting. But what you come down to is exactly your point, which is there's no human out there who is an average human. Your average human is an average human, but there is no individual who fits averageness across the board, because it's a statistical artifact. If you throw enough data points together and patterns emerge with certain distributions of frequencies, and thus you can identify somebody who's average in the middle, but look closely, and they're not going to be by some trait or whatever. That's why, I don't know, sociologists probably can tell us a whole lot more about what a change in the economy will do to rates of violence than psychotherapists can do, because one of them specializes in aggregate predictability from populations and the other one does one case at a time. And depending on what you want to know, one could be a more valid approach than the other. But yeah, individuals on the average are individualistic, and hooray for that. And we're far more variable than your average, porcupine is, because we evolved in a way where a lot more elbow room in the workings of the system.
So I want to go back to neurochemistry. So dopamine has become something that people are really focused on these days in terms of the way that our lives are structured, such that, whether it's being on social media, just the way that a phone is able to trigger all these rewards, that phones seem designed very much like a slot machine with colors and sounds and alerts and alarms. What do you advise for people that, in terms of if our goal in this interview is to get out a bunch of ideas that non-free will having beings will hopefully take on and move in a direction that's more useful? What do you tell people about dopamine detoxing? How should people approach a life if they want to not become the puppet of their phone?
I think one thing to recognize is another one of those misnomers. Testosterone is not about aggression. Dopamine is not about reward and pleasure. Initially it is, but when you look more closely, what it's more about is it's about anticipation of pleasure. It's about how great it is going to be when the reward actually happens. The neurochemistry of that is much more built around endogenous opioid-like neurotransmitters, things like dopamine is about anticipation. And even more importantly, dopamine is about the motivation you derive from that anticipation. How many times are you willing to press that lever with your paw in order to get that reward there? What dopamine is about is it's the fuel for goal-directed behavior. And that's a very different picture than dopamine is about reward and such, because it tells you the fueling of behavior with dopamine is mostly about the fueling of the ability to hold your breath and wait, because it's going to be that much more amazing when it comes. The ability to decide the future may carry a larger reward than the present, and it's worth waiting for. And, mice can do that. Monkeys can do that, and they could do that for a few minutes at a time. And we could do it, deciding that if you have a certain mindset, doing a certain sort of delayed gratification will get you into heaven when you're dead. Whoa, you could maintain dopamine as like a motivator of, anticipation of reward, and thus living a pure, sacred life or whatever, because you're going to wind up in paradise afterward, or because you're maintaining dopamine while you press the lever over and over, because you've got this bizarre thing. You want to leave a better planet for your great grandchildren. We take the basic dopamine system that motivates you to press a lever in order to get a nice food pellet if you're like a monkey sitting there or a lab rat. And then we do it for taking on a 5-generation long project of building some Gothic cathedral where you were going to train your children to be the stonemason who will take over when you die. And whoa, we could maintain dopamine up there for incredibly long periods of time. So that's the first thing people should know about dopamine in us when trying to make sense of we're the species that can hold our breath for a long, long, long time. And that's very unique. The other thing about it is you look at a baboon and you look at what are its sources of pleasure in life, what are some of the things it could anticipate. And it's basically food that you want, or sex that you're motivated about, or if you're in a bad mood, somebody smaller and weaker who you can beat up on to displace your frustration. And that's about it for a baboon's inventory of things to feel anticipatory about. But then you get us, and we've got people who could be anticipatory that, with another 14 years of digging in Olduvai Gorge, you're going to pull up a hominid fossil like nothing anyone's ever seen. And you are going to feel such pleasure. And you've been scraping there in the sun for 14 years out of anticipation that it's got to be there. And then you turn around, and then you also use dopamine because the donut you get afterward when you come in at the end of the day tastes delicious, and it's going to taste delicious. And then you turn around and you use dopamine because the smell of a flower is going to be amazing. And then you turn it around because you hope that, once again, you can have multiple orgasms in one. And then when that's all done, you go to the symphony and you can't believe Beethoven could do such things with a Picardy third chord or something like that. And we're weird because we've got to use the same dopamine system. It's the same neurotransmitter and it's the same circuitry. And we use it for everything from the smell of a flower to winning at a lottery to taking cocaine to understanding a passage of some philosopher who's impenetrable, and suddenly it makes sense. And ooh, we just released dopamine just like a baboon does when it has just killed a gazelle and is getting to eat it. What a bizarre species we are. And the only way we can do that, in that some of the time on our dopamine dial, going from 0 to 10 means a great smelling flower. And some of the time going from 0 to 10 is you've just won the lottery. The only way we can do that is it's a system that has to reset the gain on the system really fast. because right now you're doing good flower smells and you've got have to have a way to tell the system we've just switched over to winning the lottery, dopamine. And going from 0 to 10 on that is totally different than going 0 to 10 on the flowers. And people are beginning to actually figure out unique things about circuitry in the human brain of the dopamine system that allows you to reset the gain on the system. There's more little feedback loops in the wiring of the system, which is totally cool stuff and has to work that way. And once you've got a system that can reset, so you can go from doing flowers to the lottery and then back again to like solving a math equation, you got a downside to that, which I think people need to be aware of, and one that explains like an incredible percentage of human misery. If you've got a system that resets that easily, by definition, whatever was an amazing, wonderful surprise yesterday is going to feel like something you're entitled to today and is going to feel insufficient tomorrow. And that's this price of perpetual hunger that we pay for a system that constantly has to habituate to whatever the latest pleasure was, because you got to reset the whole thing for starting the appetitive motivation process all over again, and guarantees whatever's nice now is going to leave you hungry tomorrow. And like, that's how we go do things like invent, vaccines and fly to the moon and write whatever grand achievements that, we can have extraordinary sources of motivation to carry us through with that. But another way of stating that is what is okay today is going to be insufficient tomorrow. And but what have I done lately? My next novel has to be even better than this one, or my next public offering has to be even more successful than this one. We're the species that always gets hungry again is another way of saying that we're a species that always habituates to the present, which is another way of saying that we're the species that has to use the same dopamine system for incredibly different things on like the turn of a dime, spinning on a dime or whatever. And that's the price we pay. We're always going to invent new stuff, unlike chimps. Chimps make tools and all of that. And you find 20,000-year-old paleontological sites of chimps tool making, and they were making the same tools 20,000 years ago that they're making now. They don't have incremental advances in their material culture. We're the species that keeps inventing new stuff, and we're the species that also, what was great yesterday is going to be kind of boring tomorrow, and more and more and more.
So how do we avoid dying on the treadmill of dopamine?
Well, I think awareness of it is a good thing. Those of us who celebrate on a regular basis, we have somewhere in their values in our heads that what is implicit in us could be made more visible and examinable by explicit self-reflection. And we're even like able to understand literatures that showing things like implicit biases, when made explicit by self-reflection, weakens those implicit biases. Think about this stuff. Wonder why it is like what was amazing yesterday isn't feeling like quite enough today, and why it's boring now. And you should be able to get something better and more exciting and something shinier and newer and all of that. Like whether it's a neurochemist's version of understanding it, or I don't know, like what was that theologian Merton who wrote about this a lot, that level of understanding this in either version, that sort of insight should make you a little bit skeptical about the omnipresence of your hungers. And that's a realm in which, whether it's poetry or reading neurochemistry journals, if either of those accomplish that, that's a good thing. That's a good way to make mechanism work to your advantage and recognize how much we are running on hunger that like takes us up wrong pathways. And even if it takes us up the right one, isn't going to last for very long.
One thing that I found very useful in life is exactly what you're talking about now, which is the idea of just pulling something into the light, acknowledging what it is, understanding its impact, And then being able to make changes based on now that I know. That was a big breakthrough for me in my life with brain plasticity, which you mentioned at the very top of the interview. Once I could understand what was happening, I knew how to take advantage of it. So we've talked a lot about, obviously, that free will doesn't exist. We've talked about the ways that our brain works and how we're trapped by biology. Now, again, going back to the word diagram, entitlement is going to be this gigantic word. I understand what you're afraid of when it comes to free will, but now I want to talk about, at a societal level, the changes that you want to see be made. So I think that, look, your book basically breaks into two parts. Number one is free will doesn't exist, and you give extraordinarily detailed and compelling reasons why that is true. I'll sum up. For me, Phineas Gage was all I needed to hear. Like, oh, wait, I can completely change somebody's life just by damaging their brain. Like, that to me just makes it so self-evident. There could be no soul. There could be nothing beyond my ability to process. And so whether I'm disrupting that by something I'm eating that's disrupting my gut, which is disrupting the serotonin that's being made, which therefore my brain has less to deal with, like, it just seems so self-evident to me that we are our biology. And I will never understand. I have awe, and this is something you were very clear about. Recognizing this stuff leaves me in awe. I stand in wonder and the same kind of reverence that people that are religious have. I have that, and I want that for people, and I love that. But it just seems impossible for me to make the leap that we have a soul when I'm like, well, what if my brain got damaged? Like, do I then reconstitute when I'm in heaven? Like, I don't understand. It doesn't make any sense to me. Also, I have a terrible memory. Am I going to have a terrible memory in heaven? Like, this is all so weird to me. So setting that aside, though, so now we look at the criminal justice system, and this becomes the second half of the book, which is like, okay, if I can get you all to believe that is as uncomfortable as it is to embrace that free will doesn't exist, that you don't get to own your accomplishments in the way that you would probably want to, but the criminal justice system and the changes that you want, I think, will be the other controversial part. So what's the pitch in reality? So if we're going to quarantine people, what do you mean by that? And how do we actually pull it off?
Okay, so when deciding you could subtract responsibility, let alone like a culpable soul, out of making sense of humans' damaging actions against other humans, what you're left with there is, how do we protect society from people who are dangerous? And what sort of the public health model, quarantine model of infectious disease is built around is, number one, figure out how to constrain the person so that they're no longer an infectious danger to people around them. Number two, don't do a smidgen more than that, because the person doesn't deserve that. Number three, make sure you're framing that in a context where this person had absolutely nothing to do with the fact that there's some like virus fluming out of their lungs now into the air around them. And number four, put effort into understanding where disease like that comes from, original causes and stuff. And when that's turned into the same thing for dealing with like damaging humans in the way that we would call now criminality, figure out how to constrain them so that they're not dangerous anymore. Obviously, like, not believing in free will doesn't mean we'll just let murderers running around all over the place. Constrain them. Don't do it an inch more than you need to. Don't preach to them in the process about how there's some sort of soul that's relevant to all of that. And make sure, like any good public health person, you are interested in root causes and try to figure out what it is that creates people who are damaging in that way, and try to fix things at that level. And this sounds completely like, absurdly idealistic or something, but we do that all the time. And just to give two different domains, we do that all the time. You get a car whose brakes aren't working, and it's dangerous. It'll kill people. You don't know how to fix it. It's dangerous. Constrain it. Don't use it. Put it in a garage. Don't do a smidgen more than that. Don't go in every day with a sledgehammer and smash the hood of the car because it deserves retribution for the fact that its brakes failed and it hit someone. Don't preach to it. And at that point, try to figure out why brakes fail. Okay, so that's machines as machines, but what about us as machines? How do we do that where we really can subtract out a sense of responsibility and blame and culpability? We do that all the time. There's a circumstance where there's a certain type of human who's dangerous to the people around them. They will harm them, they will damage them, and this is a danger. And we have to take societal steps to prevent this from happening. And what do you do if that's your kid and they have a nose cold? You keep them home from kindergarten tomorrow, because the rule is if your child is sneezing a lot, please keep them home so they don't get everybody else sick. Constrain them, quarantine them so that they're now not a danger to the other classmates, but don't tell them they can't play with their toys today when they're home because they're bad, having caught a rhinovirus, and don't confuse health with purity of soul like previous centuries and tell them they've gotten a rotten soul and that's why they're sneezing. And make sure people are figuring out why people get nose colds and if there's a way to prevent it. Wow, we have subtracted a blemish on your pristine moral soul out of 5-year-old sneezing, and we're able to protect other kids from getting the nose cold. And we don't tell this kid that they're a rotten human because they're sneezing, and it's a more humane place and it's a healthier place. Great. That's our blueprint.
We've got two things that we've been talking about this entire episode. One is biology. Everything is downstream of that, but it's also downstream of ideas. And so the one thing that I worry about with this approach is that if we assume people don't have free will, but they are going to respond to the ideas that they're able to ingest, by one, let's take the kid example that has a nose cold. So that works. Quarantining them works because the immune system's kicking in is going to fix that. The car brakes thing, that's probably closer because there's something wrong. And let's say we're not a mechanic, so we don't know how to fix it. We know it's dangerous. We can recognize that. We can put the car in a garage. That's incarceration of some kind, whether it's a mental hospital or otherwise. And while I hope that tomorrow we have the breakthrough and this becomes the thing that you can cure, and then it's you quarantine them long enough to cure them and then you let them go. But we don't yet have that solution. So it still ends up being incarceration. Now I hear you. And one of the things you want is just to make sure that we're not smashing the car hood because it deserves to be smashed for having bad brakes. I definitely understand that, but that still feels like incarceration. And then as we get into what that's going to look like in real life, it feels like that's just going to play out the same way that we are now, because they're going to be housed with other people. It is going to be the violent and the deranged, and it's all going to end badly. The second part of this is, do you know Sam Bankman-Fried?
Do I know?
Okay.
No, but I certainly.
No. I just mean the story of what happened. So
yeah, which is fascinating.
Okay, so he's very fascinating. For people that don't know, quick primer, ends up defrauding people out of $8 billion. He's awaiting sentencing right now, but he's been convicted. Now, the weird twist here is that his mother wrote an essay called Beyond Blame, saying like, hey, like we have to, I mean, very similar to what you're saying now. I don't know that she said broken car, but like you have to separate the person from the thing that they did. And so one, I'm not saying that Sam is abusing the system, though. That is another thing you have to worry about, is whatever system you put in place, people are going to exploit it 100%. And so show me the incentives and I'll show you the outcome, says Berkshire Hathaway, I'm forgetting, is Charlie Munger. So if you incentivize people to say, "Oh, it wasn't me," which it wasn't, but like people will begin, ideas will plant themselves in people's minds that are have that criminal nature to begin with, and they're going to leverage that in the system. It's like what we see right now with, you make it, you don't prosecute people that steal less than $900 or whatever, and they'll go in and steal $899. We're watching that play out. So I worry about that. Do you think it is just pure coincidence that Sam Bankman-Fried's mother happened to write an article about that, and he happens to be the second biggest fraud of all time?
And no doubt it's competitive with Bernie Madoff because he isn't quite in his league. Sam's mother, who I am forced to note is a colleague of mine. She's a professor at Stanford Law School and has built a career about sort of issues of free will and stuff. And I can't get past the point that it's just the most wonderfully ironic thing on earth. And I can't stop just seeing that as like a meme for like the unlikely turns that happen in the world. Oh my God, of course his mother, that's what kind of legal scholar she is. And then when you look closely, that both she and her husband benefited financially quite a bit from Sam's shenanigans. Yeah, okay. We've got an irresistible version of the, oh my God, if you convince people there's no free will, we're all just going to run amok. People are going to run amok because there's no responsibility. And there have been some, unfortunately, highly compelling, convincing studies done, supposedly showing that when you psychologically manipulate people to believe less in their agency, they cheat more at games immediately afterward. Things like, yeah, we're all going to run amok because the devil is just underneath the surface, and thank God it's only the veneer of reward and punishment and societal's disdain that keeps you acting civilly, and we're all just, Hobbesian savages underneath. But then you look closer at that literature, and instead of looking at somebody who you've just manipulated into feeling a little bit less belief in their agency, get somebody who comes in and says, I don't believe in free will. I haven't believed in it forever. I don't believe in it. And you put them in a circumstance like that, and they are exactly as highly ethical as is someone who believes we need to be held responsible for our every action and all of that. What's that about? There's an amazing parallel. The other version of people will just run amok. They'll run amok if they stop believing in God. Because forget you're not responsible for your actions. This is the version of no one will hold you responsible for your ultimate actions. And oh my God, they're going to run amok and that whole thing. And what you see when you look at it is atheists, people who are stridently solid in their atheism, are just as moral in their behavior as are the most religiously observant people out there. And who are the ones who fall off but that Olympian state there? It's the people in between, for whom they don't believe in God, but it's mostly because they're apathetic about it, or they're religious, but it's just for the kids, or just in the holidays, or whatever. And what you see is this ironic thing. You get somebody who has thought long and hard about the basis of human goodness and what we owe to our fellow human and where meaning comes from and all. And it basically doesn't matter if your conclusion is, yes, we have free will and we are the agents of our action, or you conclude, yes, there is a God, or if you conclude there's no free will or there's no God. The fact that you've done the hard work to think through this is what virtually guarantees that neither end of the spectrum runs amok. And, as one quasi-anecdotal example of this, after World War II, there are all sorts of sociological studies of who are the people who risked their lives to save various outgroup members from Nazis and stuff. And it wasn't the people with rarefied philosophy degrees, and it wasn't the people who were highly religious in a particular way. It was people who were either highly religious or highly secular and were brought up that way by their parents and had built a system of moral imperatives built around that. Because you thought long and hard about it, and it doesn't really matter which end of it you wind up with. And, in the face of, but, still you're a dangerous person, you're going to put them in a prison with other violent people, and that's just a breeding ground. And that doesn't look good. I'm virtually required by law to say at this point, the Scandinavians, the Scand they have a penal system that avoids most of that. And they have a system where responsibility is viewed as far less part of the picture than the American system. And they have a system where prisoners are treated far, far better, and where the principle is one of quarantine and minimal constraint, and nothing more than that. And oh my God, people are going to run amok, and they've got 1/10 the violent crime rate that we do. And they have 1/5 the recidivism rate that we do.
Talk to me more about that. I'm not aware of that. So what do they do in the prison system? Are they educating people? Are they really cracking down on violent outbursts? How do they pull that off?
Yeah, they do all that. And they view that as a system. Okay, the greatest example is Anders Breivik. He was that white supremacist guy who 10 years ago, whatever, went and killed 75 people in Norway.
Whoa.
Went to this island where there was a whole bunch of a progressive party's summer camp for teenagers thing going on. And he killed a cop and took his uniform and showed up there pretending and mowed down 70 kids there after he had killed
Jesus.
after setting off a bomb just outside the office of the prime minister, who is a progressive liberal and in fact had grown up in that summer camp program and all of that. And this was the worst atrocity in the history of like Norway. And he made it worse by throughout his trial, giving pseudo-Nazi salutes throughout, insisting he wanted to be considered a prisoner of war of like the white Knights of Templar army trying to save Europe from the ethnic horde that, and like, and what do? They convicted him and they gave him the longest jail sentence possible that is allowed by law in Norway. He's in jail for about 20 years and he has an apartment. He has internet access. He's currently enrolled as a part-time student at the University of Oslo, irony of ironies, majoring in political science. And he's got like a fitness machine. And when he's getting a little bit lonely, like the state will pay retired cops to come and play cards with him because he's feeling a little bit isolated there, because he has renounced his beliefs and he's still dangerous. So his constraint has to involve, he doesn't get to interact much with other people. And like, that's what's done with him. And that's the sort of society they have. And amid that, they've got a far, far lower crime rate than they do for a gazillion other reasons than in the United States, because they believe governments should support the social needs of people. And, you know, off we go on the Scandinavian utopias that may not hold up to close examination all that great. So it's not just that. But the surest measure of it is you ask member of societies after that trial was completed, was justice done? And an overwhelming majority of people in Norway thought this was the appropriate thing to do with him. And you ask the family members of his victims, and there were few of them who wanted to torture him for the rest of the time. But the most average response of family members of the victims was, yeah, he's away. The government has done what it's supposed to do. He's away. And even better than he can never harm someone again, we never have to think about him again. That pathetic, broken guy who latched on to vicious, rabid ideology at some point because he had been a nobody mediocrity his whole life, and this made him feel important for a little while, and he fell into the hands of sociopaths who manipulated him with their ideology. Yeah, poor schmuck. That's how he turned out to be like that. But best of all, we don't have to think about him anymore. He's never going to hurt anyone anymore. And that's the kind of society they've constructed there. Oh my God, people are going to run amok. No, they've got a fraction of the crime rate that we do in the United States and a fraction of the recidivism rate. The purpose of their quarantine system is to train somebody to have useful skills when they come out the other end, to have a society that has a network that will give them the opportunity to live by that. And along the way, try to teach them skills about empathy and like trying to understand what damage consists of and what it is you did to other people. And whoa, it works. It works better than here. And it works better than here in a place where not only do we believe in God and free will, and something that we inculcate your average American kid in from like kindergarten, but where we prove over and over that it hasn't done any good because we're a society filled with violence and treating people terribly and stuff like that. So like, whoa, a lot that God-fearing has gotten us in this country here. Yeah, you look at the options, the comparisons to choose from, and like there's better ways of doing it, and ways that are capable of subtracting out the pleasure of punishment and retribution, and the notion that penalizing somebody is a virtue in and of itself. And you can subtract all that stuff out, and it's a more humane place, and it works better.
Such an interesting debate, this whole thing, free will, all of it. It's crazy. Robert, thank you so much for joining me today. Where can people follow you?
Oh, well, I have to say at this point, I got this book and it just got published last month, and it's called Determined: A Science of Life Without Free Will, Penguin Random House. Where people can follow me, I don't know, but my young adult children have recently gotten enthused about this, and I'm doing something now. I don't know if I'm TikToking or Twittering or Ask Me Anything on AMA on they they've set that up because they insist that I'm so. As of a week ago, I have a social media presence, and that is all I know about it. So somewhere I'm out there, and good luck finding it. I sure don't know how to, but welcome to the 21st century, even if I'm not really part of it yet.
That's all right. Free will, lacking free will has led you to that. So nobody blames you. We'll put it in the show notes. That way people can find you very easily. You are well worth following. That is for sure. Speaking of things that are well worth following, everybody, if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe. And until next time, my friends, be legendary. Take care. Peace.
If you enjoyed this episode, check out this deep conversation with Donald Hoffman about reality and consciousness.
What we are avatars of the One. The One awareness is exploring all of its possibilities through different avatars.